Hi and welcome back to my channel. I'm going to be showing you how to do a basic knit stitch. This is the most common stitch that you will use in knitting and is used with a lot of other types of stitches. So example, if you're doing a purl stitch, you'll do 1 row knit, 1 row purl. So a knit stitch is at the basic end of every type of stitch, so it is very important to know how to do this one, because if you don't know how to do it, you can't knit. So I have already casted on and done a few rows. I actually filmed this video already and from the cast on, and I found that it was quite messy and it was a little bit hard to show you. So what I will do is I'll link below the video where I've actually casted on. I've gone off camera and knitted these, make it a little bit neater for you to see. So another name for knit stitch is garter. So this is when knit stitch is done on each row. So as you can see, it is quite a squiggle effect. And then if I flip it over, it is the same on that row, on that side. So we want to work, so you'll have your work with the current stitches on in your left hand, and you'll be working to the right with your right needle, no stitches. We'll be grabbing and working from there. So very similar to the cast on, you go in behind that stitch, around with the yarn, pull it nice and tight, pull it through and lift it up and pull it off the needle. I'll do that one more time. So in that little loop there, around and pull it off. I'll zoom in to make it a little bit easier for you to see. So I'm just going to push my existing stitches up a little bit higher so I don't have to keep pushing them forward. So we're going through that loop, but across, overhead, around and pull it through. As you can see, you're picking up that yarn and pulling it onto the new one. So this stitch essentially gets dropped and gets put in behind. So behind, around, through and off. In that little hole, behind, around, through and off. As I mentioned in my last video, there is a few different techniques. There's a different terminology depending on what type of knitting that you're doing. So I work off English terminology. There is also American terminology, which I have come across. I think there might be a few more, but I haven't actually come across those. So the important thing to know is basically the differences. In all of them, you're going to kind of be working a knit slash garter. That's the most basic. You'll also see, if you do tend to watch other videos on knitting, the way that each different technique is that some people hold their needles slightly different. They may even work their stitches a little bit different. It does get the same effect. This is the way that I was taught. I was taught from my grandma when I was a young girl. And I just find it the easiest to do. I have tried working with other techniques, but I always revert back to this because it's just so much easier for me. And I find I'm a lot faster, but you could be different. So do your research, find out what works best for you and work that way. So we've got that last stitch, and as you can see, I kind of group them all together, pull them apart, have a look at it, make sure everything's nice and neat. I tend to do this after every row because for me, it could be just a psychological thing, but I just find that it makes everything a little bit neater. So flip it round and we're going to be working on the next row. So as you can see, that first one is a little bit looser. I'm not sure why that does it, but it kind of does it. So you're going to go in, around, pull it through and off. Something which I tend to do with the first stitch, after doing it, I tend to kind of pull that round and keep it a little bit tighter. That just kind of creates a nicer edge for me personally. Some people will do a slip stitch where they'll actually, instead of actually knitting the stitch, they'll just pick it up and transfer it over to the other needle and then knit the rest. They'll do that only for the first stitch. I have done that before. For me personally, I find this way gives me a nicer edge, but everyone knits differently. So again, whatever works for you is what you can do. As you can see, I'm getting a little bit faster. The more rows that I do, my tension gets a little bit easier to work with. I get used to it and it becomes more consistent, which makes it easier with knitting. I do want to point out that when you do begin, don't be too hard on yourself. You have just learnt this. It is easy to do, but it does take time to kind of figure out your tension, figure out how you do things. When I first started, I was nowhere near good. I've seen projects that I did. I was a little girl and I had drop stitches. I had, yeah, it was just a mess. I can't even explain how bad it was. Even now, the other day I actually picked up a project that I've been working on for a little while. I keep starting and stopping it, and half the project I started about a year ago, and I picked it up, compared it to the half that I'd done recently, and went, oh wow, my technique has changed. I'm so much better than I was. So I actually undid it, redid it, and I actually found that I did more rows but better tension, so I managed to use less yarn. Okay, so we've got our rows, we've got our knits done. So I want to point out a few little hints and tips that I use. So as you can see, this is on our right side. This is the one that we've just pulled everything over. So when you're picking up your yarn, if you put it down, go make yourself a coffee and come back to it and go, oh no, what am I on? You can see that on this side, the loops are underneath the actual knitting needle. If you flip it round, the loops are on the needle. So these little bits here. So that's your last row that you've done. This is also good to remember when you are counting your rows at how many rows you've done. So I tend to count. So do you see how there's kind of a little gap between those first two? I tend to count where I can see that gap. I check first where my last row was, so I know my last row was on this side. You can also tell because it's on my right side, not my left, but it took me a while for my brain to actually figure that out. So we're going to count our rows. So we don't count the cast on row. Well, I don't anyway. So you've got a row in behind here. So what you've got to remember is that when you knit, you go behind, and then the next row you've gone behind. So technically it's at the front for you now. So you've got to count that row behind. So you go 1, 2, hi Wessie, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then the last row we did was here. So we've got 9 rows here. When you're also starting a project, you will also notice that the first 2 rows are quite a mess. This one was really, really messy when I first started, but I just kept knitting and it eventually kind of cleared itself up. Once the yarn has time to kind of drop, it's not constricted by the actual needle. It does give you a nice effect. Another example of this is, as you can see on the needle, this is actually quite high. And same with this side, but then as you can see on the actual sides, it's quite neat and tidy, and it's quite easy to keep that quite even. When you do first start, you'll notice that this will become a little bit crooked. You may pick up rows, you may drop rows, but if you're very careful with your work, you won't. I'll just show you what I mean by picking up a stitch. So I'm just going to knit one, or I'll knit 2. Just to keep that tension a little bit better. So some things that people do is they come in and they accidentally grab this stitch here, or they'll grab this row here. Try to be, especially when you're learning, very patient with what you're doing. make yourself a nice cup of coffee, go sit on your balcony, watch the sunset, watch the sunrise, something where you're nice and relaxed and you're doing this. When you do get better at knitting, you will eventually be able to sit in front of the TV, watch some Netflix and knit away a scarf. But when you're first starting, I would definitely recommend that you don't do that. So just to show you how easy it is for you to pick it up. So if you're not paying attention, you'll just go in around and you can just pick up that stitch. Something that you don't want to do, because that will mean that your actual project will be uneven, and when you're first starting it's going to be uneven enough because you're not going to have your tension right. By doing that, it's just going to put you off a little bit more. Also making sure that you're not dropping those stitches, so when you're pushing it forward or pulling it off, you're not accidentally pushing too far and then picking up this stitch. Make sure that you kind of keep them a little bit back. Your needles will have this point on them. I try not to work on the point. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to do. You just do it around and then pull it off. The only time I try to keep on that point is when I've got this needle in behind and I'm working on that stitch. I also never ever stop in between a stitch. So never go, ooh, I need to go get the door, put it down. That's where I find I tend to drop things. Finish that stitch, finish the row if you can, put it down, come back, pick it up, look at it and go, okay, this is where my yarn is, this is my right side, this is my left side, I'm working this way. So we'll finish this row. Again, behind, around, through the loop, off. Behind, around, through the loop, off. And as you can see, before we had it this way, now it's this way. So I hope this tutorial was easy for you. Oh, one more little tip that I use. So on my ball of yarn, if there is a plastic cover on it or paper cover, I keep this on just because it kind of makes it a little bit easier to pull that yarn through, and it keeps it quite nice and tight. Less mess, easier to pack up. When you're finished, you just slide to the end, put the needles there, and put them in the middle. And you're done. If you have any questions, just send me a message. I do actually check my Instagram a lot more. I probably won't really be monitoring this page. I may, I'm not sure how I'm going to go. So just shoot me a message. My Instagram is EMILYA KNITS. I will link it down below. And yeah, thank you for watching.